Before getting started, I need to issue a disclaimer here. Specifically, I am not a medical doctor, nor do I have a medical degree of any kind or any kind of license to practice medicine. Therefore, my opinion or anything that I say in this video must not be construed as medical advice of any kind, shape, or form. So now that that is out of the way, I wanted to read testimony that was given to the United States Congress in June of 2021. This is from the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. My name is Stephen Quay, and I am honored to speak at this forum. I am a physician scientist with over 360 publications on a wide range of topics in science and medicine. I have 87 issued patents in 22 different fields of medicine, including the chemistry of RNA drugs like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I have invented 7 FDA-approved medicines that have been used by millions of people worldwide. I appreciate the nonpartisan approach the subcommittee is taking today. Clearly, science in the last few years, but especially on topics related to the COVID pandemic, has been co-opted by geopolitics. Thus, I am here not as a mouthpiece for any political party, but as an American scientist. I dedicate my testimony today to the more than 600,000 Americans that this pandemic has killed so far, with the hope that by clarifying the origin of COVID, we can help to prevent future pandemics and the loss of innocent lives. Given this backdrop, I will be keeping my remarks today to matters of science. I will state facts and evidence about the pandemic that I have collected. I will explain why those facts lead to certain conclusions, allow a particular inference, or rule out a hypothesis about the origin. Today's testimony is an effort to answer the question posed on December 30th, 2019 by Dr. Zhenli Shi, the head of coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She had just been told that a novel coronavirus had caused an outbreak of pneumonia at hospitals close to her laboratory in Wuhan. In what I believe was her last unscripted public utterance, she has been quoted as saying, "Could they have come from our lab?" In the last 18 months, we have learned an immense amount about the origin of the pandemic. But one of my frustrations is that virologists and science writers around the world seem to want to ignore what we have learned and the inevitable conclusion it reveals. As inconvenient as it is, I believe the evidence conclusively establishes that the COVID pandemic was not a natural process, but instead came from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, and that it has the fingerprints of genetic manipulation through a process called gain-of-function research. There are 6 undisputed facts that support this hypothesis. As a reminder, all zoonoses are diseases that involve a virus infecting an animal, the animal coming in contact with a human, and then the human being infected. The question of the origin of a zoonosis is the question of the location of the animal. In natural zoonosis, the animal is in nature, a cave, a farm, or a market. The infected human comes in contact with that animal. For lab-acquired zoonosis, the animal is in a laboratory or in cells from an animal in a petri dish, and the human works in the lab. In deciding between a natural origin or a laboratory origin, there are 6 facts no one disagrees with. The Chinese first told the world that the COVID pandemic began in the human seafood market because approximately 1/2 of early cases had been associated with that location. This would have been reminiscent of the 2 previous coronavirus epidemics, as both SARS-1 and MERS began in live animal markets. However, after 18 months of investigation, we now know it did not begin in a market in Wuhan for the following 3 reasons. First, none of the 11 patients from the Hunan market or another market were infected with the earliest virus, meaning they came into the market already infected. The 4 patients with the earliest version of the virus all had one thing in common. None had any exposure to the Wuhan market. And remember, this is the market where it was originally stated that the novel coronavirus came from via transmission from some animal that was in this market to a human. But this testimony from this scientist is saying, hey, all of the information that we have based on the testing of these patients after the fact has told us that none of the Wuhan patients had the earliest form of the virus, meaning it's not possible that it was contracted there because they had to have come into the market with a later version of the virus, meaning it started somewhere else. Obviously, there will be debate about whether or not this is true, but this is very interesting to me because I cannot remember ever hearing this at the time when all of the information was coming out about the pandemic. I don't remember any news source ever covering this. And I was following it pretty closely. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but this is pretty clear evidence that it did not originate in this market if what this scientist is saying is true. And we have to have a little bit of hesitation about immediately assuming that, right? Because scientists can be corrupted for a wide variety of reasons, and they can lie for a wide variety of reasons. But this scientist is under oath in front of the United States Congress, and he is presumably telling the truth. We knew in January 2020 from public scientific databases that the patient with the earliest first complete virus sequence was a 39-year-old man treated at the General Hospital of Central Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army of China, located on Wulu Road in the Wushan district of Wuhan. I mean, I'm sure I'm pronouncing all of these names wrong. About 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. After 18 months and almost 3 million viruses sequenced worldwide, his virus remains the earliest. Second, none of the environmental specimens from the market had the earliest virus, meaning they came into the market. This included 1,055 samples of frozen food in the market, all of which tested negative for COVID. Third, 457 animals from Huanan market were tested. All were negative for COVID. 616 animals from suppliers to the market were tested. All were negative. 1,864 wild animals from southern China of the type found in the market were tested for COVID and were all negative. I never heard any of this information. These data from the publicly available World Health Organization report established that it did not begin in the Huanan market or any other market in Wuhan. So, according to this scientist, this was in a WHO report that apparently I didn't read because I was not aware of this information. Now, maybe other people who followed it more closely were aware of it, but to be honest with you, I was following it from a distance because I kind of already knew what it was in terms of the larger agenda, so I didn't focus on the details too much. 2. Failing to find it in any market in Wuhan, the search was expanded to all of China. But after testing 80,000 samples from 209 different species from other markets, farms, and nature, the virus has not been found in a single specimen. The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is about 1 in a million. This is what you expect for a lab-acquired infection. Now, remember how this works. There was a lot of information out there about the quote-unquote lab leak hypothesis from people with all kinds of official credentials that presumes they are trustworthy. And in that context, you have to remember how the conspiracy theories are always planned into these events in advance. In this case, in particular, we all saw it transpire in real time where the lab leak hypothesis was promoted by certain characters, and that then bled into criticism of the vaccine that was later produced to deal with the coronavirus, which the mainstream media then used as evidence of medical misinformation. Hey, you have all of these people on the internet that are claiming to be doctors or claiming to give medical advice that are not qualified to do so. This is medical misinformation. This is dangerous. This could cost people their lives. So we need to censor all of this. But you can only do a censorship campaign like that if you start with kernels of truth in everything that you will later use as quote unquote disinformation to censor with. So yes, there are true things within all of that, within the quote-unquote lab leak hypothesis, and within the quote-unquote dangers of the vaccine, the quote-unquote side effects. that any vaccine is capable of producing, which is well documented scientifically speaking. But those two facts were blown out of proportion by the chosen conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, who then are used to censor the whole thing so that the truth of what's really going on never comes out in a way that is easily understandable. People just throw their hands up in the air at some point and say, I don't know what to think, because there's just so much information out there and so many claims of this person not telling the truth and that person not telling the truth. I don't even know what to think. And that is the chaos that they intentionally produce with their pre-planned conspiracy theories that by design only tell half-truths so that the other side can point at them and say, look, we can easily debunk this. They're lying to you. This is dangerous. We need to censor them. This testimony here, given in front of the United States Congress, is very easily showing that it is extremely unlikely the virus came from a market in Wuhan, China, like they told us. But that fact that they always knew would later come out was totally obfuscated by the people who were discussing it, because they contributed so many more ridiculous and easily debunked claims with that. This is like David Icke, who was front and center during the pandemic claiming that the virus itself did not exist and it was from 5G technology. That's what everyone was really experiencing. And then right away, the news is pointing at that saying, oh my gosh, guys, look at these people on the internet. Look at this conspiracy theorist who we have known as a conspiracy theorist for decades now, saying these outrageous things that are easily disproven. He's saying the virus doesn't even exist. And that confuses people, right? They don't know what to think now. Oh, well, does the virus even exist? I don't know what to think. What's going on here? And that's how it's done, okay? Though that is just one example of it. I could go on for hours detailing each and every way, right? But let's keep reading here and not lose focus. After testing 9,952 stored human blood specimens from hospitals in Wuhan from before December 2019, there was not a single case of COVID in any specimen. It was expected that between 100 and 400 would be positive. The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is also about 1 in a million. This is what you expect for a lab-acquired infection. There is no evidence of multiple animal-to-human transmissions. With 2 prior coronavirus outbreaks, SARS-1 and MERS, 50 to 90% of early cases were from various animal-to-human infections. For SARS-CoV-2, 249 early cases of COVID-19 were examined genetically, and they were all human-to-human transmissions. For a community-acquired zoonosis, the probability of this occurring is the same as flipping a coin 249 times and getting heads every single time. This is, however, what you expect for a lab-acquired infection. 5. SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on its surface called a furin cleavage site, and a unique code in its genes for that site called a CGG-CGG dimer. So 2 independent levels of uniqueness. The furin site is why the virus is so transmissible, why it invades the heart, the brain, and the blood vessels. This is important, and we'll come back to it. Viruses like Ebola, HIV, Zika, yellow fever all use furin sites, and this is part of the reason for their deadliness. But the entire group of coronaviruses to which SARS-CoV-2 belongs does not contain one single example of a furin site or one CGG-CGG dimer code. A comprehensive study by an MIT group shows that there has never been a furin site or the CGG-CGG letter code in this group of coronaviruses for at least 1,000 years, since William won the Battle of Hastings in 1066 to become monarch of England. So for 1,000 years, the coronavirus had not had a furin cleavage site like the one that they found in SARS-CoV-2. But since 1992, in gain-of-function experiments, The Wuhan Institute of Virology, or the WIV, and other laboratories around the world have inserted furin sites into viruses repeatedly. It is the only sure method that always works and makes viruses more infectious. And the CGG code found in the COVID virus is commonly used in laboratories around the world, including the WIV. You can literally order it from a supply company on the internet. By the way, some virologists have said, but Dr. Quay, furin sites and codon dimers occur in one or more of the other 4 groups of coronaviruses, and with a process called recombination, a COVID-like virus could easily pick one up. So that's an important piece of information, actually, that there are other groups of coronaviruses that do have this thing. So it's not necessarily as rare as maybe he made it out to be in the prior paragraph, but at least as it relates to the history of SARS-CoV-2 and where it came from, there had never been one of these furin cleavage sites detected before for 1,000 years. This is wrong for 3 reasons based on well-known fundamental biology. Because coronaviruses do exchange genetic material so easily, the very existence and stability of the 5 distinct groups is evidence from nature that there must be barriers to the exchange of genetic material. I have spoken previously about the 1,000-year stability of the group COVID belongs to. If recombination was easy, this group would have been merged with the other 4 into a single group over the last millennium. That's a really good point, right? He's saying, hey, recombination as it's stated, or at least as we understand it now, would make it very likely that the line of coronavirus that COVID comes from would have at some point recombinated with the other lines that have these furin cleavage sites, if that is the process we're describing here, that would have created this naturally. It most likely would have happened at some time in the prior 1,000 years, as opposed to just now, if we have this evidence of the other versions of the coronaviruses doing this. 2 things stop recombination between groups. First, recombination happens when one poor bat is infected with 2 different viruses, and during that co-infection, genetic material is exchanged. Here, the groups of viruses that have furin sites, or CGG dimers, don't infect the same bat species as the COVID-like viruses that don't have these features. The COVID virus can only exchange genetic material within its own group, a group that has not had a furin site or a CGG dimer for 1,000 years. Second, even if you force 2 different viruses into a cell in the laboratory, unique gene sequences are required for genetic exchange or recombination to occur. The hotspots, quote unquote, where exchange can occur are different for each group and incompatible between groups. In a clever use of this concept, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a leading coronavirus scientist from North Carolina, once made a vaccine candidate that was resistant to recombination by using synthetic biology to change the hotspot gene codes. Finally, SARS-CoV-2 was pre-adapted for human-to-human transmission from the first patient. Specifically, the part of the virus that interacts with human cells was 99.5% optimized. That's incredible, right? It was almost 100% optimized to interact with human cells from the very beginning. When SARS-1 first jumped to humans, it had only 17% of the changes needed to cause an epidemic. As evidence of the relevance of this work, the UK strain that emerged in the fall of 2020 that was more infective was a change in one of the few hotspots that was not optimized at the beginning. So it became actually more deadly in the fall of 2020 because it engaged in this recombination process. Which again kind of goes back to the idea that for 1,000 years that had not happened with this particular strain. And then once it's in the wild, this new version of it, it shows evidence of doing that immediately with other strains of it, and it changes genetic sequence. But again, remember, as I'm discussing this, I don't have the expertise to truly understand what it is that I am discussing, so there's probably so much nuance here that I am missing when just reading this scientist's conclusions on the matter. But hopefully we're getting a general idea as non-experts of what really most likely happened here. Some virologists may claim the COVID virus was not pre-adapted and point to evidence it has been mutating a lot since it first emerged, making new variants like the Delta strain currently in the news. But the details tell another story. COVID does randomly make on average about one genetic mistake every 2 weeks. So after a year of circling the globe, it will naturally have on average about 26 changes somewhere in its gene code compared to when it started. But the vast majority of those mistakes are either neutral, having no effect on the deadliness of the virus, or actually detrimental, making the virus weaker. Less than 1% actually improve the virus. So how do I believe the COVID virus was taught to infect humans in a laboratory? A commonly used gain-of-function method to optimize the COVID virus would have been by serial passage in a laboratory on a humanized genetically modified mouse that can develop a human-like pneumonia. You infect the mice, wait a week or so, and then recover the virus from the sickest mice. Then you repeat. In a matter of weeks, this directed evolution will produce a virus that can kill every humanized mouse. However, it is a challenge to create these humanized mice for the serial passage in the first place. Here, the WIV has acknowledged that for several years, they've worked with humanized mice developed in Dr. Ralph Barrick's laboratory in North Carolina and funded at U.S. taxpayers' expense. In closing, let me say to the families of those who have died from COVID, I am dedicated to applying my scientific and medical expertise to understanding how this pandemic happened and, importantly, helping put safeguards in place at our research institutions to be sure this never happens again. Now, this is from the same doctor, much more recently, published December 26, 2024, the thromboinflammation and neuropathology sequence motifs of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein appear to have been engineered into the virus. A landmark paper entitled Fibrin Drives Thromboinflammation and Neuropathology in COVID-19 was published in August 2024 that concluded the mechanism of the thrombotic and neurological symptoms following a SARS-CoV-2 infection, often called long COVID, is attributable to the binding of fibrin to discrete portions of the spike protein, specifically 3 N-terminal domains. This paper is a high-impact publication with over 110,000 views, placing it in the 99th percentile of articles published contemporaneously. Here I examine the regions of the spike protein that bind to fibrin, fibrinogen, or both. The N-terminus of the spike protein contains the 3 strongest binding peptides, and surprisingly, these regions are also the 3 insertions in the protein sequence that are unique to SARS-CoV-2 and not found in natural SARS-CoV viruses. All pre-pandemic SARS-CoV viruses have either a partial deletion in these regions or have protein amino acid substitutions that are non-conserved and therefore would not support fibrin binding. And as I understand it, he's referring to this line of coronaviruses that COVID came from, that SARS-CoV-2 came from, that were unchanged in this way for the 1,000 years. In addition, the 3 inserts also correspond to regions of the spike protein that have been shown previously to have high sequence homology with the HIV GP120 protein. GP120 is an HIV surface protein that binds to a host cell surface receptor on CD4 plus T cells and facilitates cell entry to begin infections. In comparing the immunological and clinical presentation of HIV and COVID-19 patients, the commonality of D-dimer production, CD4 plus lymphopenia, neurotropism, and IL-10 expression strongly suggests that these protein sequence homologies are clinically relevant. A conclusion that the pathophysiology of long COVID is based on the insertion of spike protein motifs with sequence homology that mimic the HIV GP120 protein motif properties, and that these SARS-CoV-2 motifs are not found in the SARS-CoV virus subgenus strongly suggests that these inserts were design features in the synthetic assembly of SARS-CoV-2. Put another way, this scientist is saying, hey, based on our research, we are increasingly getting closer to the hypothesis being accurate that COVID-19 was inserted with HIV to make it more devastating of a pathogen. Evidence the HIV-like sequences in SARS-CoV-2 are functional in patients. Both SARS-CoV-2 and HIV infect CD4 plus T cells in patients, leading to IL-10 expression, immunosuppression, lymphocytopenia of CD4 plus cells, and poor clinical outcome. When HIV first appeared on the clinical scene in the 1980s, it presented as opportunistic infections in several immunocompromised patients. This was traced to a specific and severe lymphopenia of CD4 plus cells via binding to the CD4 surface glycoprotein via the trimeric. In 2023, it was found that SARS-CoV-2 also caused a drop in CD4 plus cells by infecting those immune cells via an interaction between the CD4 surface glycoprotein and the S1 region of the spike protein. Both SARS-CoV-2 and HIV produced clinical evidence of fibrinogen activation via D-dimer elevation. If the GAG protein of HIV and the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 have a biochemical interaction with fibrinogen, activation of coagulation would be seen in elevated D-dimer levels in patients infected with these viruses. And the D-dimer test is, as I understand it, what they use to see if you have blood clots. So, again, if I understand this correctly, this scientist is alluding to the possibility that SARS-CoV-2 was modified with aspects of HIV to specifically infect the CD4 immune system cells that is somehow resulting in blood clots as one symptom of long COVID, among all of the others. And going back to that sentence that I said I would get back to in the prior congressional testimony, it's so dangerous, right? Because it's crossing the blood-brain barrier and all these other barriers because of how infective this addition of HIV into the virus potentially made it. That's why they're having all this trouble figuring out what long COVID is, why people are still suffering from it, and why some people just for whatever reason don't manifest long COVID when they're infected with the virus, or whichever strain it might have been at whatever time it might have been. This is where the idea of, oh, hey, it's just a cold came from. That was based on this total disinformation. This is not just a cold. This is a very dangerous pathogen, especially when it originated, that can do very dangerous things to the body. And then that's how they create this artificial debate that goes back to the idea of confusing people, where the vaccine that they produced, this mRNA technology that was brand new, that injected your body directly with the spike protein, the same spike protein that is doing the damage through SARS-CoV-2, you have similar responses to it. But if you're trying to get at the truth of it and you're looking at the information on the internet, you have this one side that's saying, oh, everything that happens is because of the vaccine. Look what it's doing to everybody. And they're lying about it. And then you have the other side that says, oh no, these vaccines are completely safe and effective. This is most likely long COVID. And it's like, no, guys, it's both. And they're trying to distract you from that most likely fact. Again, I'm not a doctor. This is just what I'm getting from reading other experts on it. It's most likely both. Both the spike protein from COVID and the spike protein from the vaccine is extremely dangerous, and you can have side effects from it. But anyways, it's really interesting that this HIV information is becoming more plausible as we progress through time, because originally, as I'm sure most of you will remember, Luc Montagnier, the virologist who won a Nobel Prize for co-discovering the HIV virus, someone inserted small sequences of HIV into the original COVID pandemic virus. He died after he presented the findings aired here on a French mainstream media platform. And this is a tweet that was referencing an interview that he did. And if you remember, as Luke recounted in this interview, right when the pandemic started, there was a group of Indian researchers who stated the same thing, and then that was quickly retracted. But they stated that there seemed to be evidence of HIV in this COVID virus. But they were forced to retract that paper. And then Luc Montagnier, who co-discovered the HIV virus itself, who would know what to look for, in other words, came out on French television and said, hey, someone inserted small sequences of HIV into this virus. It is not natural. It was a very meticulous job. So now there's 3 separate instances amongst actual legitimate scientists who are as credible as it gets. The researchers in India, the co-founder of the HIV virus itself, Luc Montagnier, and then this Dr. Quay, who are doing this research and saying, hey, this SARS-CoV-2 virus was intentionally altered to contain aspects of the HIV virus. And we know how dangerous the HIV virus is, right? I mean, there is no cure for it still. At least as they tell it, there are treatments that presumably can let somebody live a very long life with it. But I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert. I don't even know how these things work, if I'm being honest with you. So none of this is medical advice. I'm just reporting on what I have found on the internet. And I assume that we are still allowed to do that on YouTube. I don't know. We're about to find out when I post this. We'll see if they let it stay up.